welcome to Dialogue. There have been over 33,000 deaths in Gaza after the past 6 months of conflict, and the humanitarian crisis is only getting worse. There are in total over 2 million people trapped in the Gaza Strip who are highly dependent on outside humanitarian groups for daily necessities and medical services. But despite continuous calls from the international community, relief supplies are still hindered and aid personnel have been repeatedly attacked. What are the main difficulties of humanitarian work in Gaza? Can the ceasefire resolution of the UN Security Council and the slight shift of the U.S. attitudes improve the situation of healthcare workers? Will Israel's redeployment of its troops and possible military action in Rafah bring about a greater humanitarian crisis? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today is Christopher Lockyear, Secretary General of Médecins Sans Frontières, one of the largest independent medical and humanitarian relief organizations in the world. Welcome to our show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mr. Lockyear, could you please first do some introduction of your organization for our viewers who might be not that familiar with your organization? What's the purpose and what's the vision?
With pleasure. So Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, as we call it in English, is as you say, it's a medical humanitarian organization. We prioritize our work in areas of natural disaster, epidemic, but really primarily in conflict. We're an organization that works in around 70 countries around the world. We have just under 70,000 staff, and we work based on the principles of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And we really try and challenge ourselves to go where the medical and humanitarian needs are the greatest in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, since October 7th, basically over the past 6 months, you and your colleagues have insisted on providing medical assistance to civilians in the Gaza Strip who have been caught in the crossfire. So what is the current living conditions of the residents in Gaza? Has the situation changed, like from the past?
Yeah, well, it's changed dramatically since before October the 7th, and I think the important thing to realize is that the living conditions are very different in different parts of the Gaza Strip. In the south, in Rafah, you have around 1.5 million people who are tightly packed, many of which have fled from further north. In the north of the Gaza Strip, we've really got a siege within a siege, and the people living in the north are living really scrambling to get basic food needs, and they can't get basic food needs on a daily basis. And then in the middle area, we've got hospitals which are under such huge pressure; they're overflowing with patients. And so it's a very dynamic situation, but very different from place to place within Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm. Given such a situation, so what are the priorities? The current priorities of the MSF right now in the Gaza Strip?
Our priorities are to try and provide as much healthcare as possible, and the reality is that that's very limited. We're working mainly in the Rafah and the middle area. Getting access to the north, where we know that the needs are very acute, is incredibly difficult. So we would like to have access further up north, which is all but impossible. But it's a very, very difficult place to work because the security situation for our teams of all humanitarian workers is very difficult, and this is also in a context where the food needs and the malnutrition rates are going up as well. So although we're not principally a food provider, we're having to treat the medical condition of malnutrition. So as well as getting greater medical support, we desperately need more food aid in as well.
More food aid right now. Operations at the largest hospital in the Gaza Strip, Shifa Hospital, came to a stop early this month, April 1st, after 14-day, siege over there. And you mentioned in your recent speech that the healthcare system in Gaza is being systematically destroyed. Based on your on-site observation, how are the remaining 10 major hospitals currently operating?
Well, I would start by saying Shifa is not the only hospital which is out of action. If you take Nazir Hospital in the south, that's also impossible to work in at the moment. And I would say that the remaining hospitals, the picture is very different. I mean, I was there just a couple of weeks ago, and an Al-Aqsa hospital in the middle area is a hospital where, as you go in, there are patients everywhere. There are patients on both sides of the corridors. You have to walk incredibly carefully not to tread on patients who are waiting to go into surgery or waiting to have their wounds dressed. I mean, and in that hospital, at the same time, medics are having to make the impossible choice between choosing to give beds to trauma patients who have severe wounds and children who have need for intensive care for malnutrition. Further south in Rafah, I also visited the Indonesian Rafah Field Hospital, which is primarily a wound care center. And in that hospital, there were two wards, a ward for men, a ward for women. They were both completely full. And with people who need the most awful wounds, dressing, burns from intensive bombings. A lot of these patients need to go under general anesthetic just to have their bandages changed. The wounds are so horrific and complete.
Mm-hmm. And Israel, announced the withdrawal from Gaza. Do you think there's a relief, a sigh of relief that that remaining hospitals, their operations will continue?
The fear that we have is a ground incursion, a ground invasion of Rafah. I don't know precisely what this withdrawal means, but what is very, very clear to me is that a ground offensive in Rafah would be utterly catastrophic. I mean, I've described a little bit the situation in the north and the middle area. Where would people go? But the density of people in Rafah is extraordinary. I mean, I was driving around Rafah, and a car journey that used to take 10 minutes traveling east to west is now taking an hour because the streets are narrower, because there are tents and makeshift shelters on both sides of the streets. I mean, I can't imagine any scenario of a ground incursion in Rafah which is not utterly terrifying and catastrophic. Most of the limited health provision is in the south, is in Rafah. So that would also destabilize the basis for humanitarian action in the Gaza Strip. If we don't have the ability to work in Rafah, where do we work? And we're incredibly mobile. The humanitarian community as a whole is used to emergencies. We're used to moving around. We're used to resetting up hospitals. We're used to redistributing food in different areas. But this place is so confined, so densely populated, and this war is so brutal and dynamic. It is almost impossible to imagine how do we set ourselves up in other areas of Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the recently released footage, we have seen the despair of people in Gaza, and even some parents have said that they would rather have not given birth to their children so that they couldn't suffer. And, medical teams have added a new acronym to their vocabulary, as you said, WCNSF, wounded children, no surviving family. And also you said in the speech, these psychological injuries have led children as young as 5 to tell your team they would prefer to die. I mean, in the normal situation, people would imagine, 5-year-old is worry-free and, having the best fun of their life. But this is the completely opposite. So this is the situation. I mean, how desperate the situation is for the children as well as for their parents, right?
You summarize it very, very, very well. I mean, I think what we're going to have in Gaza is not just a generation which is living with physical trauma, with disabilities from the wounds that are happening, but a generation that is generations which are going to be living with mental trauma as well. I spoke to one of our psychologists in the Rafah, in the Al Muwazi area of Rafah, for a clinic that we're running there. And she was telling me just how a couple of weeks before, she herself had lost 8 members of her family. And this is the conditions that healthcare workers and aid workers and the whole of the community is working in Gaza, in that we're asking traumatized people who have lost family members, who have displaced multiple times, to be the carers in the community. And we're asking a huge amount from them. I mean, one anecdote that I had whilst I was there was that somebody told me that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, doesn't exist in Gaza because it's ongoing stress disorder. And you're absolutely right. This is going to carry on for generations. It is affecting kids. It is affecting parents. It is affecting families. And it is a really, really sad and heartbreaking situation that we're seeing.
Your organization, together with others, have been providing assistance, as you said, to people suffering from conflicts in particular around the world. But in the Gaza Strip, the challenges for humanitarian workers are particularly severe. Why is that?
Well, there's a number of elements to look at it here. One is the supply of equipment, products, food, medical supplies crossing the border, and that's a really important factor. But it's not everything. I mean, there is no doubt there is less coming into the Gaza Strip than before October the 7th. But what we've also seen is something of a narrative which oversimplifies the humanitarian effort. So boiling it down to simply trucks crossing the border is a distraction, because it's also about moving supplies around the Gaza Strip. It's being able to distribute food safely. It's about being able to have healthcare workers who have eaten, who are mentally fit to be able to treat patients. Running a hospital is more than simply four walls and a roof. It's about running water, it's about fuel, it's about communications, it's about electricity. And all of these things have been targeted and are undermining the humanitarian effort. And there are a number of key indicators of this. The fact that we're relying on airdrops, or airdrops are being used as a form of humanitarian assistance, is a key indicator that the humanitarian effort is failing on a global scale. It's not an indicator of success. Any humanitarian worker will tell you that airdrops are incredibly ineffective when it comes to providing the depth of aid that is needed and the targeted aid that is needed. And so we're really, for me, this is really an admission that the scale up of aid, as demanded by the International Court of Justice back on the 26th of January, is really not being adhered to and is failing.
Yeah, it's failing. Adding to that is of course, the attack, let's say, on aid organization. For example, the recent one, World's Central Kitchen, they announced that basically on April the 2nd that Israeli airstrikes resulted in the death of 7 of their personnel in Gaza. And the organization immediately, suspended operation in the area. So, WCK has also been providing food for your staff. Have food services since been restored? How about your staff?
Well, the WCK, the World Central Kitchen incident, was a really horrific incident, and my condolences go out to the friends, family members, and colleagues of the organization that was doing an amazing work in terms of feeding large numbers of people in Gaza. But I would also point out, first and foremost, this wasn't an isolated incident. We ourselves have had 5 people killed, but there's now 200 humanitarian workers that have been killed in this conflict. This is a pattern of events, and I hate to say it, but it's taken some Western aid workers to be killed to get the attention around this pattern that's been happening within utter impunity, and this really has to stop, because this is one of the key factors, going back to your previous question, why it's so difficult to provide aid in the Gaza Strip, because if you can't keep aid workers safe, then they can't deliver the services that are needed. But to get directly to your question, no, there still needs to be further scale up in terms of feeding in Gaza, both in terms of feeding staff, feeding families, but also bringing food supplies into all areas, particularly the north, which is, as I said, the north of Gaza is a siege within a siege, and we're still having stories of our staff who remain in the north having to mix human food with animal food just to be able to get enough calories to survive. It's not enough calories, but to be able to substitute their diet to even the most meager degree.
You said 200 humanitarian workers were killed in this event. What happened to this humanitarian law countries are supposed to follow?
I think that's the critical question. I mean, humanitarian workers are protected. Medical workers, medical facilities are protected. I would go back and call for all hospitals to not be used for military purposes, to both sides of this conflict. But also, we need to. One of the key cornerstones of international humanitarian law is proportionality, and what we see from the pictures of what has happened in Shifa Hospital is, all I can imagine is a total disregard for the principle of proportionality when it comes to international humanitarian law. And I would call on all sides to adhere to that, not just through legalistic goals, but through moral goals as well.
Well, in recent speech, you said, of course, this is, beyond the humanitarian assistance. You see, in terms of personnel getting killed, that's humanitarian groups. They are targeted, but also health workers, journalists, UN personnel, schools, and homes. All followed the same pattern. You said this pattern of attack is either intentional or indicative of reckless incompetence. But as we continue to see this happening, so what do you think is more likely the case? Intentional, or is it indicative of incompetence?
Well, I would go. I mean, what I would say is that there is this pattern of attacks which has been happening for several months now. It's what the world has seen is the incident around World Central Kitchen, and I would say it's a very deliberate thing that this has been allowed to perpetuate, that this has been allowed to continue, because we've been saying it for months. It is a terrible incident, and if there's one good thing that can come from this terrible incident, is to highlight that actually this incident wasn't isolated, and that humanitarian workers, both Gazan workers, Palestinian workers, but also international organizations, have been struggling in this environment of impunity for months now. And it's been a deliberate choice to not prevent these attacks from happening. That goes to both the Israeli forces, but also from Israel's allies, from the US, the United Kingdom, the EU, for not holding them further to account. And we've seen just in the last few days, when there is pressure applied, things can change. It hasn't changed enough, but things can change with some pressure applied.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of that, the pressure or international pressure, on late March last month, obviously the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for immediate ceasefire and also the transfer of aid. Because the U.S. finally stopped blocking such efforts. It abstained from the vote, but immediately the U.S. said that the resolution is unbinding. I want your response to that. And of course, people would ask, since when UN Security Council resolution is unbinding?
I mean, what is needed in Gaza, above and beyond anything else, is a ceasefire. It's an extraordinary thing for my organization to call for a ceasefire. We don't normally make such comments about the nature of a conflict. We're used to working in conflict all around the world. We have people working at war zones every day of the year. But we've been saying for months now, because this situation is so brutal, because the population is besieged, they're trapped, they cannot move, getting aid into the Gaza Strip is almost impossible, both from a logistics but also from a security perspective. The only real thing which is going to change the fact that thousands of people are being killed, number one, and secondly, being able to get the humanitarian assistance in that they really need to make the difference that is needed, is a ceasefire. And I would implore all parties, all members of the Security Council, to ensure that what was voted at the end of March was not just an act of political theatre, but actually a really substantial call for a ceasefire, which needs to not just happen now, but it needs to have happened several months ago.
Mm-hmm. Are we seeing any signs of a decreased military activity since the passage of the resolution?
There is nothing that I could say that would substantiate that. I mean, certainly we are preparing our minds that this is going to continue, that we don't see an end yet. I would implore everybody to bring this conflict to an end, both sides, to bring this conflict to an end as soon as possible. But I'm not seeing any evidence for a change as of yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, after this World Central Kitchen incident there, the U.S. president had a phone conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who promised basically, that we'll take more measures to avoid such incidents, in the Gaza Strip, and also they will improve the situation for humanitarian workers in the Gaza Strip. So, are we going to see an improvement in that respect?
Well, I would hope so, but I'm not in control of that element. What I would say is that we would see, so far we've seen a complete failure of the coordination mechanism. We always speak to the the fighting parties in a conflict. That's how we try and negotiate our presence in war zones. and we're used to doing that. It's been an incredibly difficult exercise to do that within this conflict. We have a number of incidents that have happened, and we're still seeking investigations on those follow-up of those incidents, because we want accountability for what has happened to our staff, because we find it wholly unacceptable. And what I would say is that I don't understand how you can improve that coordination and that safety of aid workers at the same time as still talking about a ground invasion or ground offensive in Rafah. Those things are entirely incompatible in my mind.
Are you sensing in any sense, I mean, the change of attitudes or slight change of attitudes in terms of protecting security, I mean, these humanitarian assistance workers here?
I mean, I think it's too early to say. I mean, if last week was the horrendous incident of last week was a tipping point that changes that, then maybe that's, you know, I hate to say it, a positive thing that can come out of this really horrendous incident. But as I say, it's about respect to humanitarian workers, but it's primarily about how this war is being fought, which is hugely catastrophic. We've seen absolute carnage of not just tens of thousands of people, but whole neighborhoods. And really, first and foremost, it's that needs to change to be able to protect, well, to be able to reduce the civilian lives lost, and then allow humanitarian workers to do their jobs.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, we know the U.S. Earlier we mentioned the U.S. is probably the only country with real influence on Israel. So, you know, there are criticism, and to be honest, on one hand, the U.S. administration talked about even sending the aid to Gaza. At the same time, they are transferring weapons to Israel. It's kind of contradictory here, obviously. So, what's your sense of that kind of policy here?
Yeah, well, I would probably go further than calling it contradictory and say it's complicity. If you are enabling this really awful conflict to continue, I mean, humanitarian assistance can only ever be a drop in the ocean. You know, this is not solving the conflict. And I think what we've seen in this situation is humanitarian assistance being used as an alibi to continue the war. The images of humanitarian assistance. I mean, I'm incredibly proud of what our teams are doing, what humanitarian workers in general are trying to do in Gaza. They're running good quality, really impactful programs, but they're reaching a tiny amount of the population, and a huge proportion of the population has been killed. And it makes no sense to me to, on one hand, be providing humanitarian assistance, on the other hand, providing weapons which are used in these horrific acts that we're seeing in the Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm. Well, on April 7th, Israel withdrew all troops from southern Gaza. Israeli Defense Minister Gallant announced that the withdrawal of troops is to prepare for future missions, including the expected offensive in Rafah. He said, quote, "The forces came out of Gaza and are preparing for their future missions. We saw examples of such missions in actions at Shifa," end quote. What does it mean to hospitals in Rafah? Is there a danger that those hospitals could be also, let's say, bombed, for whatever reasons?
I'm utterly terrified about what a ground offensive in Rafah could mean first and foremost for the people that are there. And if people do leave the Rafah area, then where do they go? As I was saying, the whole neighborhoods in the north have been destroyed. The pressure on hospitals like Al-Aqsa in the middle area is extraordinary. I mean, there's no extra capacity. There's no extra capacity there. I don't know how you can run hospitals in an area such as Rafah, which comes under intense fighting. Let me give you an example of a conversation that I had in the Indonesian Rafah Field Hospital, which is in the south. It's the one that's treating, which is a wound specialist that specializes in treating wounds. I was speaking there to our teams and to the hospital director, and I said, "What do you do if there's a ground invasion of Rafah?" And they said, "Okay, well, we will close the outpatient wound dressing center, so those people that need to come into the hospital 2 or 3 times a week to have their dressings removed, rather than those that need to stay in hospital. We'll close that. We'll turn that into an emergency reception area for wounded. In the meantime, we're trying to develop an ambulance system to be able to evacuate staff out of this hospital. And then I asked the question, where are you going to evacuate them to? And they couldn't answer that question. And for me, that's a really significant indicator of the fact that a ground invasion of Rafah would be utterly horrific for the people who have fled there and are still fleeing there. When I was there, people were still fleeing to this area. But also, where do they go? This is what completely baffles me.
Yes, besides the ceasefire call from the UN Security Council resolution, and the UN's top human rights body has also called on countries to stop selling or shipping weapons to Israel in a resolution passed last Friday. But the US and Germany opposed to such a resolution. US, Germany, for whatever reasons. What do you want to say to these countries? They continue providing weapons to Israel. I mean, at least the international condemnation, international pressure is mounting, obviously, for a ceasefire instead of rather than providing more weapons here.
I would say the UN Security Council has a responsibility to make this stop. I would say that any nation that can, linked to both sides of the conflict, has a responsibility to make this stop. There is the need for an immediate ceasefire. I think that if you are providing the weapons that are allowing these horrific incidents to happen, you are complicit, and that much stop. At the end of the day, we have to put the population here first, and it is them who are suffering. It is them who are the victims of this. And as international community as a whole, as individual states, be that the US, the UK, the EU, Germany, we all have a responsibility to make this stop in any way that we can.
With that, we come to the end for today's discussion. Many thanks to Christopher Lockyear. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Qin Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.